The dust of dry river hung suspended in the air like a funeral shroud, thick and choking, clinging to every weathered plank and sunbleached sign that lined the main thoroughfare. The town had been carved out of red earth, and desperation a collection of rough, hewn structures that squatted beneath the merciless Arizona sun. It was high noon, the hour when shadows retreated beneath boot heels and the blistering heat made men cruel. Thaddeus Crow, known throughout every gambling hall, brothel and whiskey den from here to the territorial capital, as Lightning Bill stepped into the center of the street with a half-empty bottle of rot-gut whiskey swinging from his left hand. His right hand scarred across the knuckles from 100 brawls and perpetually ready hovered near the worn walnut grip of his Colt Navy revolver. The weapon was an older model pre-war manufacturer, its blued steel dulled by years of hard use. Behind him, a knot of cowhands and drifters clustered like buzzards on carrion, their laughter sharp and vicious. Two Apache girls, neither older than 10 summers, knelt in a puddle of brownish water, left by the previous night's brief, useless downpour. Their buckskin dresses decorated with careful beadwork in geometric patterns of red and blue clung to their thin frames darkened with filth. Their braids carefully woven that morning by hands that loved them. Them now hung limp and sodden against their narrow backs. Their small hands were clasped together in front of their chests, fingers trembling like cottonwood leaves in a storm, shoulders shaking with silent sobs that they tried desperately to contain. Bill tilted the bottle with theatrical slowness. Whiskey cheap corn liquor that burned like hellfire going down streamed out in an amber arc, splashing over their glossy black hair, running down their copper-brown faces in rivulets, pooling in the churned earth around their knees. The alcohol stung their eyes, making them water. One girl flinched violently and whimpered a small animal sound of pain. The crowd roared with laughter, men slapping their thighs and pointing with calloused fingers. "Look at him squirm." One cowhand shouted, his voice thick with whiskey and malice, like rats in a rain barrel. Bill grinned, showing teeth stained tobacco brown and chipped from biting down on cartridge paper. The brand on his left shoulder, a crude 5-pointed star burned into the flesh, was hidden beneath his sweat-stained shirt. But the cruelty it represented was plain on his face. "Reckon we ought to clean up this town." He drawled loud enough for the gathered onlookers to hear clearly, starting with the vermin that crawl through it. From the edge of the boardwalk, a woman pushed through the crowd with furious determination. She was Apache, her face angular and striking with high cheekbones and a jawline that spoke of generations who had survived in harsh country. Her dark eyes blazed with a fury that could have ignited dry tinder. She wore a plain cotton dress, threadbare from washing, but meticulously clean, dyed a deep indigo blue. Her hair was bound back with a strip of red calico cloth. Her name was Quanah, and, clear's throat, she had walked into this town, knowing full well what it might cost her. She dropped to her knees in the slick earth beside the girls, wrapping her arms around their shaking shoulders, pulling them close against her body. Whiskey soaked into her dress, the sharp smell mixing with the scent of sun-baked dirt and fear. She did not care. "Enough," she said. Her voice was low but steady as bedrock, each word carved from stone and thrown down between them like a challenge. "They are children." Bill nudged her with the toe of his scuffed leather boot. Not hard enough to knock her sprawling, but with just enough pressure to make his dominance clear. "Town's got a bounty on every Apache head, lady," he said, his grin widening to show more of those ruined teeth. $20, no questions asked. You ought to be thankful I'm just washing them. Could be doing a damn sight worse." He raised the bottle again, preparing for another degrading pour. The crowd pressed closer, eager as hounds before a hunt, their breath sour with tobacco and anticipation. Then a new voice cut through the jeers, sharp and clear as the crack of a Winchester rifle. "That's not washing." The voice said each word precise and deliberate. "That's cowardice." The laughter died like a candle flame in a gust of wind. Heads turned with jerky, startled movements. An Apache warrior sat astride a sweat-ulcered bay horse at the edge of the crowd. The animal's flanks were heaving foam, flecking its bid evidence of a hard ride. The man wore worn cavalry trousers in Union blue, the kind issued to Army scouts at Fort Concencade, and a faded blue wool jacket over a buckskin shirt decorated with quill work. A Springfield carbine rested in the saddle boot, and a Remington revolver was holstered at his hip on a military belt. His face was lean, weathered by sun and wind, marked by a thin white scar that ran along his jawline from a knife fight years past. His dark eyes calm and unblinking, as a hunting hawk's fixed on Bill, then moved deliberately to the girls, then to Quanah's trembling shoulders. The man's name was Taji. He had spent the better part of 5 years as an Army scout, tracking his own people for officers who could not tell one Apache from another and did not care to learn the difference. A faint white scar circled his left wrist, like a bracelet, the mark of iron shackles that had once cut deep into flesh during a forced march to the San Carlos reservation. He knew precisely what a white town could do when it smelled blood in the water. Hands drifted toward holsters, up and down the street, a ripple of movement like wind through dry grass. The metallic click of hammers being thumbed back sounded in the tense silence. The air grew taut as a bowstring drawn to the cheek. If Taji moved wrong, if he so much as twitched toward his weapon, the street would erupt in gunfire, and he would be cut down before his horse took 3 steps. The town held its breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder. Taji dismounted with careful deliberation. Every motion was slow and visible, hands open and held away from his body. His posture calculated to project calm rather than threat. He had learned over the years, through beatings, through close calls, through watching other men die for less, how to move around white men without triggering their fear or their anger. Though sometimes, as now, it made no difference whatsoever. He walked into the churned earth, his boots squelching in the mixture of water and dirt, and knelt beside Quanah without touching her. Physical contact between unmarried Apache men and women in public was improper, a violation of custom that would shame them both. He looked up at Bill, his expression carefully neutral, showing nothing of the rage that coiled in his chest like a rattlesnake. "Let them stand," he said quietly. His English flawless but accented. "I will take their place if you need someone to pour whiskey on." Bill studied him with the amused interest of a cat watching a cornered mouse. "You the tame scout they keep over at Fort Concencade?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt for the word tame. Taji did not answer. Behind him, the street opened out to the prairie-rolling grassland that stretched toward a hazy line of blue hills 40 miles distant. And beyond those hills, the narrow, precious thread of the dry river itself. That river was the only thing keeping the Apache camp alive. A scatter of 30 wickiups and small fields carved out of poor rocky soil. The same town that now laughed at soaked children had been slowly strangling that camp for months, diverting water upstream, driving off game, making survival a daily battle against deliberate cruelty. From the doorway of the medical office, a lean man with tired gray eyes and salt and pepper hair watched the scene unfold with a weary tension of someone who had witnessed too many such moments. Dr. Malcolm Hayes wiped his hands on his blood-stained canvas apron, his jaw tight beneath his neatly trimmed beard. He had come west during the war, fleeing personal demons and searching for redemption and service. What he had found instead was a frontier where cruelty was as common as cactus and justice as rare as rain. Farther down the street, Outside the tiny schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, a young woman in a plain gray dress stood with a single Apache boy at her side. Her fingers gripped his shoulder so hard that his homespun shirt wrinkled beneath her grasp. Her name was Helen Cartwright, and she had come from Boston 2 years earlier with romantic notions of civilizing the frontier through education. Those notions had been ground down by reality, but her stubborn determination remained. The boy, named Nal Nish, was 7 years old and could already read better than half the white adults in town, a fact that made him dangerous in their eyes. Sheriff Dietrich Consincade lounged outside the jail, his considerable bulk propped against the doorframe. A thin cigar clamped between his teeth. His mustache was waxed to stiff points that jutted out like tusks, and his badge was polished to a mirror shine. He watched the confrontation with the detached interest of a man who had already decided which side would win, and was merely waiting for events to confirm his judgment. Over his shoulder, a freshly painted signboard advertised the Dulac and Western Rail Company in bold red letters, promising progress, prosperity, and a brighter future for Dry River. Taji and Quanah both knew that name with bitter familiarity. Pierre Dulac was a railroad investor and cattle baron who had arrived from New Orleans 2 years earlier with leather satchels full of maps and money. He had been systematically buying up land, offering loans that turned into chains, making promises that evaporated like morning dew. The railroad spur he planned would connect Dry River to the main line of the Southern Pacific. 50 miles west, opening new markets for cattle and grain. It was a sensible plan, a profitable plan backed by legitimate investors in San Francisco. The only problem was the Apache camp, which sat directly in the path of the proposed route occupying land Dulac had already promised to his shareholders. Bill finally lowered the bottle with theatrical reluctance. He tossed it to one of the laughing cowhands, who caught it and took a swig. "You want to stand for them, Scout," Bill said, his pale blue eyes glittering with malice. "Fine. Just remember, this town has a long memory, and memories can be dangerous." He turned and walked back toward the saloon, his spurs jingling with each step, Mexican RLs oversized and cruel. The crowd slowly broke apart, some disappointed that no blood had been spilled, others muttering about uppity Apaches who didn't know their place. The line had been drawn as clearly as if someone had scratched it in the dirt with a knife. Taji helped the girls to their feet with gentle hands. Their legs shook beneath them like newborn colts. Quanah kept her arms around them, guiding them toward the side street that led away from the main thoroughfare. Taji followed 3 paces behind his right hand, resting casually near his holster, his eyes scanning the boardwalks for threats. Dr. Malcolm stepped out into the harsh sunlight, holding a clean flour sack towel. "Bring them to my office," he said quietly, his voice pitched for their ears alone. "Wise in the eyes burns like blazes. They'll need rinsing." Inside the cramped, cluttered office that smelled of carbolic acid and blood, Malcolm rinsed the girls' faces with cool water from a china basin. He worked quickly, his hands, gentle but efficient, checking their eyes for damage. The girls did not cry. They had learned early that tears brought more trouble, but their eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. While he worked, Malcolm spoke in a low voice that would not carry beyond the walls. "There is a voucher system in the sheriff's office," he said, his New England accent still faintly audible beneath years of frontier living. $20 for any hostile Apache. No questions asked about whether they're actually hostile or just inconveniently located. Men like Lightning Bill Crow make their living on those vouchers. Dulac pays them extra to push your people toward desert land, where the river cannot reach land where nothing grows and children starve. Taji absorbed this information without surprise. He had suspected as much, but confirmation settled in his gut like lead. "The Army knows?" he asked. Malcolm shook his head, water dripping from his fingers. The army looks the other way. Dulac has friends in the territorial capital. The governor's brother-in-law is one of his investors. As long as no one makes too much noise, no one sends unfavorable reports to Washington, they let him do as he pleases. Quanah met Taji's gaze over the girls' heads. Once before raids and relocations and the army's hollow promises, they had been promised to each other in the traditional way. Her father and his father had agreed when they were children, and the arrangement had seemed as natural as the turning of seasons. But then the soldiers came in '68, and the families were scattered like leaves before a storm, and promises became dust on the wind. Now they stood in a stranger's town, tied together mostly by shared anger and a history that could never be reclaimed. "You still work for the Bluecoats?" Quanah said quietly, her voice edged with accusation. "How many times have you watched things like this and looked away?" It was a fair question, and it cut deep. Taji had no easy answer. The badge on Consincate's chest, the telegraph wires humming with messages from distant cities, the Springfield rifles racked in every doorway. These were the things that kept him from drawing his gun and ending this confrontation here and now. But the whiskey dripping from the ends of the girl's braids felt like a line he could not step back from. Not this time. Not this time. He said each word a vow. The town of Dry River had been built on greed and luck in roughly equal measure. A thin vein of low-grade copper in the hills had drawn the first prospectors. In '63, and a mail route that passed through had sustained a small population. But the copper had played out within 3 years, the ore too poor to justify the cost of hauling it to a smelter, and the Snort's mail route had been shifted 15 mimides south to follow a better road. Now all that remained was the river itself, a sluggish, muddy stream for most of the year, but reliable even in drought. Whoever controlled that water controlled the future. Pierre Dulac understood this better than anyone. He had arrived with surveyors' transits and engineering charts, offering to buy land at fair prices, promising jobs and prosperity. The railroad spur he envisioned would make Dry River a shipping point for cattle from ranches scattered across 50 mi of territory. It was a sensible plan backed by legitimate capital. The only obstacle was the Apache camp, which occupied bottomland with the best water rights. Dulac had tried negotiation, first offering to relocate the families to land farther north, even providing wagons and supplies for the move. When the elders refused, pointing out correctly that the northern land had no permanent water and no game, Dulac had changed tactics with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had built his fortune by removing obstacles. He began paying men like Lightning Bill to make life unbearable. Crops were trampled by midnight riders. Tools mysteriously disappeared. Livestock was scattered or shot. When Apache men rode into town to complain, they were arrested for trespassing or public drunkenness. When they stayed away, they were accused of plotting attacks. The pressure was working with methodical cruelty. Families were leaving, drifting toward the San Carlos Reservation, or deeper into the mountains where starvation waited. Quanah's brother, a man named Cochetta, and father of Halea and Yoki, had refused to go. He had argued that their ancestors were buried along this river, that the land was theirs by older right than any deed or survey. Quanah had stayed to help him, though she harbored her own doubts. Rights meant nothing when the other side held all the guns and wrote all the laws. That evening, as the sun dropped toward the horizon and the brutal heat began to ease into merely oppressive warmth, Taji prepared to ride back to the camp. He checked his horse with practiced hands, tightened the saddle girth, and filled his canteen from the iron pump behind Malcolm's office. The water tasted of rust and minerals, but was safe to drink. Malcolm came out wiping his hands on a rag that had once been white. "You should stay in town tonight," he said, worry creasing his weathered face. Bill and his boys will be liquored up by sunset, and they'll be looking for someone to take their temper out on. Taji shook his head. The camp needs to know what happened. They need to prepare. Malcolm hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "Take this," he said, pressing it into Taji's hands. "I have been keeping records for 18 months. Every Apache who comes through my office with a bullet wound, every broken bone that matches the pattern of a rifle butt, beating every piece of evidence I can document. It is not legal proof, but it is something. It shows a pattern." Taji took the ledger and tucked it inside his jacket next to his heart. "If they catch me with this, they will hang you." Malcolm smiled grimly. "Then do not get caught." "No." As Taji rode out of town, the moon rose thin and pale over the prairie like a tarnished silver coin. The land was parched, cracked in places where the river had been dammed upstream for Duloc's cattle operations. Cottonwoods crouched along the banks like arthritic old women, their roots exposed and grasping. The camp was too quiet as he approached. No cooking fires, no voices calling children home, no normal sounds of evening life. Then he smelled smoke, not the familiar scent of mesquite cooking fires, but the acrid stench of burning canvas and tar paper. He spurred his horse into a gallop. The attack was already underway when Taji reached the camp. Masked riders tore through the wickiups like a whirlwind of destruction, firing revolvers into tents, kicking over baskets of precious grain, trampling garden plots where squash and beans grew. Women and old men scattered in every direction, some clutching ancient rifles, most clutching children. A scream cut through the chaos, high and sharp as a blade, a child's voice raw with terror. Taji dropped from the saddle while the horse was still moving, hitting the ground at a run. He tackled the nearest rider, slamming the man into the packed earth with enough force to knock the wind from both of them. The rider's mask jerked sideways, revealing Lightning Bill's grin made demonic by firelight. "Well, look who came home," Bill said, swinging the butt of his Colt like a club. The blow caught Taji on the side of the head, filling his vision with white sparks and the taste of copper. They fought in the flickering firelight, fists and elbows and knees, dirt ground into eyes and mouths, the kind of brawl that had no rules and no mercy. Bill was heavier by 30s alibi and meaner by nature, using his weight to pin Taji against the ground. Another rider wheeled his horse around and leveled a double-barreled shotgun at Taji's exposed back. His finger tightened on the trigger. Before he could fire, Quanah burst from behind a burning lean-to with a garden hoe in her hands, the long-handled kind used for breaking sod, and swung it like a war club. The iron blade connected with the shotgun barrel just as it discharged, knocking the aim sideways. Buckshot ripped through canvas and rope instead of flesh, the blast deafening at close range. Taji threw Bill off balance with a desperate heave and dragged Quanah behind a stack of firewood. Bullets chewed into the logs, spraying splinters that stung like hornets. A woman fell 10 paces away. Old Nisha's wife clutching her chest, her body crumpling into the shadows like discarded clothing. When the riders finally retreated, hooves pounding into the darkness, leaving behind only dust and destruction. Taji's arms trembled with exhaustion. His head throbbed where Bill had struck him. His knuckles were raw and bleeding skin torn to the bone, the campfire of smoke and spilled grain and fear. Among the trampled earth, half hidden beneath an overturned wagon, he found a leather saddlebag stamped with a pressed seal of Duloc and Western Rail Company. Inside was a folded survey map marking a spur line running straight through the Apache camp, with notations in neat handwriting. Clear by October 15th, and compensation $500 total dispersal. This was not random hatred born of whiskey and prejudice. This was business cold and calculated. Quanah stood over the body of her brother Cochetta. He had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the throat when he tried to speak. His blood soaked into the dry earth, wasted like spilled water. His eyes were open, staring at the stars he would never see again. The two girls, Hialia and Yoki, clung to Quanah's skirt with desperate fingers, their faces blank with a kind of shock that steals words. Quanah's jaw was set like iron even as her fingers shook. "You said the army watches the railroad companies," she said, her voice flat and hard as beaten metal. "Will they watch this?" Taji looked at the saddlebag, at the survey map with its clinical notations, at the dead scattered like broken dolls, at the girls whose father would never stand again. He thought of the vouchers in the sheriff's office, of Dulac's friends in the territorial capital, of the telegraph wires that carried only the messages men in power wanted to hear. "No," he said, finally the word torn from somewhere deep. "We will." At dawn, when the sky turned the color of old brass and the air was briefly cool, Taji and Quanah rode into Dry River again. This time they brought the saddlebag and map wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from dew, of the girls riding double behind Quanah and old Naichi as witness. Despite his 70 years, the old man's wife was dead. He had nothing left to lose. Dr. Malcolm met them on the edge of town, his medical bag in hand. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his wire-rimmed spectacles and cleaned them on his vest. "You go to the sheriff with that evidence," he said, his voice low and urgent. "He will not thank you. More likely, he will arrest you or worse. But I will verify the caliber of every bullet we pulled from your people. I have kept samples, documented everything." Inside the cramped sheriff's office, which smelled of stale cigar smoke and gun oil, Concade sat behind his battered oak desk with his boots propped on a stack of territorial circulars. Pierre Dulac leaned in the corner like a gentleman at a social gathering, well-groomed and utterly calm. His wool suit was brushed and pressed despite the heat, his collar crisp, his cuffs held with silver links. Lightning Bill lounged near the door, his boots still carrying dried blood and ash from the previous night's raid, his grin lazy and confident. Taji laid the saddlebag, the survey map, and a blood-smeared cartridge on the desk with deliberate care. "Your hired guns attacked an Apache camp last night," he said, keeping his voice level. "They killed unarmed people, women, and elders on land your surveyors want for a railroad spur." Dulac did not even blink. His voice was smooth as aged whiskey touched with a faint New Orleans drawl. "Those Apaches raided a freight wagon last week," he replied, his tone suggesting he was merely correcting a minor factual error. "They stole property belonging to the Dulac and Western Company. My men were simply reclaiming what was stolen and ensuring the safety of this community." Concade dragged out a folded sheet of yellow telegraph paper and dropped it on the desk with theatrical flourish. It was a wanted notice freshly arrived on the morning wire from the territorial capital. The ink still crisp and black. Reward for capture of renegade Apache scout known as Taji, suspected in the murder of rancher Henrik Olsen 2 days prior. Description: Apache male, approximately 30 years, scar on jaw, employed as Army scout, armed and dangerous. $50 reward, dead or alive. Taji felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had never even met Henrik Olsen, did not know what the man looked like or where his ranch was located. Bill's grin widened into something wolfish. "Funny how you were seen near his burned field 2 nights back. Gout. Real shame about the .44 cartridge found near his barn that matches the Army-issued sidearm you carry. Same manufacturer, same year." Taji understood with cold clarity. Someone had planted evidence, his revolver, or one identical to it, at the scene of a murder. It was a simple frame, but devastatingly effective in a town where an Apache's word meant nothing against a white man's testimony. The sheriff's hand closed on the grip of his pistol. A Colt dragoon so old it might have seen service in the Mexican War. You bring accusations while you yourself carry a price. Consincade set his voice thick with satisfaction. Looks like I'll earn both a bounty and the thanks of this town for taking you in. Taji calculated distances with desperate speed. He could maybe shoot Consincade and grab Duloc as a shield. But Halea and Yoki stood near the door, wide-eyed and frozen with terror. If guns roared in this confined space, the girls would die in the crossfire, their small bodies no match for flying lead. Before he could move, Helen Cartwright appeared in the doorway. Her plain gray dress dust covered from a hard ride, her normally pale cheeks flushed. "Sheriff," she said, her voice higher than usual, but steady enough to carry. "There is a telegraph from Fort Consincade. Just arrived at the relay station. The colonel requests the scout for questioning first. He says any arrest must happen under Army authority, as Taji is currently under military contract." It was a lie, a complete fabrication, and everyone in the room knew it. But the delay bought precious seconds. Consincade swore under his breath, a string of profanity that would have shocked his mother. "Get out of my way, you interfering schoolmarm, or I'll charge you with obstruction." In that instant of distraction, while Cade's attention was divided between Helen and Taji, Malcolm yanked open a side door leading to the narrow alley behind the jail. Now he hissed. They scrambled through the opening as Consincade shouted. Bullets slammed into the doorframe, spraying splinters and lead fragments. They ran for a buckboard wagon Helen had left unhitched in the alley, the horses still in harness, but untied. A lanky blond man with a thick Scandinavian accent and sunburned face whipped the horses into an immediate gallop the moment they threw themselves aboard. "Thought you might need proof I wasn't murdered." Henrik Olsen yelled over the thunder of hooves and the rattle of wheels on packed earth. Posy shots rang down the street like strings of firecrackers. One round grazed Taji's left shoulder, a hot line of fire that spun him sideways. He nearly tumbled from the bouncing wagon vision, graying at the edges, the world tilting. Quanah hooked her arm around his waist with desperate strength and hauled him back onto the wagon bed, her teeth gritted with effort. Behind them, Bill swung into his saddle with practiced ease, raising a cloud of choking dust as he spurred his horse into pursuit, leading 5 riders. They fled along the river road, the wagon bouncing over ruts and exposed roots wheels, slamming into rocks hard enough to crack spokes. Dust boiled up behind them in a brown cloud. When they finally abandoned the wagon in a stand of cottonwoods several miles from town, the horses blown and luthered, unable to continue. Taji's left arm throbbed with every heartbeat, and his shirt was slick with blood that ran down to his elbow. There was no time for gentle nursing or proper medical care. They had minutes at most before the Posy found their trail. Henrik and Malcolm tore strips from a grain sack with frantic hands, packed the wound with clean moss gathered from the damp riverbank, and slung Taji's arm against his chest with a crude sling fashioned from rope. Malcolm's hands were practiced, but rough. Frontier medicine was about stopping bleeding and preventing infection, not comfort. "Bullet passed clean through," Malcolm said, probing the wound with fingers that made Taji see stars. "Missed the bone, but you have lost blood. You need rest, or you will lose consciousness." Rest was not an option. They made a small hidden camp under the cottonwoods, where the river had cut a shallow, slow curve, and the overhanging branches provided concealment. The children slept in the wagon bed, finally collapsing from exhaustion. Quanah patrolled the riverbank with Henrik's borrowed Winchester, her eyes scanning the darkness for movement, her ears tuned to the sound of hoofbeats. Henrik explained his situation while binding his own blistered hands. He had fought the fire at his field with nothing but wet burlap. Dulac had tried to buy his water rights 3 times, each offer lower than the previous one. When Henrik refused the third time, men came in the night and set fire to his wheat field. They left Apache arrows scattered in the ash, poorly made fakes that no Apache would have crafted, and reported to the sheriff that Henrik had been murdered in a raid. "Man wants the whole river," Henrik said bitterly, his Norwegian accent thickening with anger. "Every drop, every acre, and anyone who drinks from it or plants seed in it must pay tribute to him or be destroyed." They discussed options until the sky darkened from blue to indigo to black. Helen arrived just after full dark, leading a sway-backed mare she had borrowed from a Mexican farmer who owed her a favor. Her skirts were muddy from fording the river at a shallow crossing, her hair escaping its pins. "That was foolish," Malcolm scolded, but his voice carried more worry than anger. "If they catch you helping us, they will run you out of town at best." Helen's jaw set in a way that reminded Malcolm of his own daughter, dead these 10 years from cholera. "Then they will have to catch me first." She brought news that chilled them all. Dulac planned a public meeting in 2 days Saturday evening, when the most people would be in town to address the Apache problem and gain public support for a complete removal by force if necessary. The territorial governor had already given preliminary approval pending local consensus. More dangerous Dulac's men had been seen hauling crates marked with black powder stamps toward the abandoned Coal Creek mine, where a small immigrant wagon train was camped on its way west. The immigrants were Czech and German families, a dozen souls who spoke little English and understood less of frontier politics. If that camp was attacked and Apaches were blamed, Dulac would have all the public support he needed for a full military action. Malcolm opened his ledger, the one he had been keeping for 18 months. Page after page listed patients' dates, injuries documented in meticulous detail. Over and over, he had recorded Apache women and children with bullet wounds from .44 caliber weapons manufactured by Remington, the same manufacturer whose weapons were standard issue for Dulac's hired guards. Up to now, it had been only pattern and suspicion, circumstantial evidence that no court would credit. With the saddlebag, the survey map, and the testimony of Henrik, a white man whose word would carry weight, it became something more substantial. Someone needs to carry this to a federal marshal. Malcolm set his finger tracing the entries. "There is one in Tucson, a man named Garrett, who is said to be honest. But if I leave, Dulac will control the narrative completely. He will tell the story he once told, and these people will believe it." Taji gripped the edge of the wagon with his good hand, his wounded arm hanging useless. "We do not have time to reach Tucson and return. We have only us here now." Late that night, while they huddled in the darkness, planning their next move, Bill and a small posse searched along the river. They were close enough that Taji could hear the jingle of spurs, the creak of saddle leather, and the low voices discussing which direction the fugitives might have fled. Acting on desperate instinct, Taji, Quanah, and Henrik guided the children silently into a side channel where the river ran deeper and faster, the current pulling at their legs. They used a length of rope tied between 2 cottonwoods to keep everyone from being swept downstream. The water was shockingly cold, fed by mountain snow melt even in late summer. Hella slipped once going under her small hand, torn from Quanah's grasp. Quanah lunged after her, lost her own footing on the slick stones, and went down hard. Taji, his wounded arm screaming in protest, braced the rope with his shoulder and reached out with his good arm, catching Quanah's dress. Together they hauled Hia back to the surface. The girl choking and gasping, they emerged on the far bank, soaked and shivering, while Bill's riders cursed on the near side, fooled by moonlight reflecting off the water and the dense screen of reeds. Crouched side by side in the reeds, water streaming from their clothes, Taji and Quanah caught their breath. Her wet sleeve stuck to his injured arm, cold cloth against hot flesh. He did not pull away. Neither of them spoke. There was too much risk of being heard, but the awareness between them sharpened like a blade drawn from its sheath. Two people who had once been promised to each other as children, now bound by something raw and more immediate than tradition. The next day, moving on foot because the horses had been left behind, they followed Henrik's knowledge of back trails toward Coal Creek. The prairie rolled out around them in endless waves, short grass burnt brown by summer sun, occasional outcrops of red sandstone, distant antelope that watched their passage with liquid eyes. Taji walked despite the pain that lanced through his shoulder with every step, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. On the trail, Malcolm shared what he had uncovered through careful investigation and loose-tongue drunks in his examination room. During the war, Lightning Bill Crow had served under a Confederate colonel named Jethro Stark, a man notorious throughout the territory for burning Apache villages along this very river. Colonel Stark had believed that the only way to secure the frontier for white settlement was complete extermination. Not relocation, not reservation, but death. He had prosecuted that belief with systematic cruelty, burning homes, destroying food stores, shooting anyone who resisted and some who did not. That colonel had died in a skirmish with Union cavalry in '64, but Crow had survived. Malcolm had seen a distinctive brand on Crow's shoulder once years ago when stitching a knife wound after a saloon brawl. A crude five-pointed star burned into the flesh, the mark Colonel Stark had put on all his men to mark them as his personal regiment. Taji stopped walking. His face went still as stone. "That colonel," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all emotion, had a scar down his left cheek from a Mexican saber. He wore cavalry boots even after the war ended. He killed my father while I watched from behind a rock. I was 8 years old. He shot him for refusing to tell where the women and children were hidden. The past snapped into sharp focus, like a telescope bringing a distant object near. Bill was not just a bully with a gun and a cruel streak. He was a direct link to the massacre that had shattered Taji's family, killed his father, and set him on the path that led here. At Coal Creek they approached with extreme caution, bellies to the ground, using every scrap of cover. The wagon train was there, as Helen had reported. 4 canvas-topped wagons circled for protection, surrounded by men and women going about the ordinary business of life on the trail. Names drifted on the morning air in languages Taji did not speak. Olria Anton Rose, immigrants who did not yet understand that this land had invisible lines drawn in blood. Hidden above the camp in a jumble of boulders, Taji found what he was looking for, and Snorts, what he had dreaded finding. 6 wooden crates of blasting powder manufactured by the Giant Powder Company, each stenciled with warnings in English and marked with the Dulac and Western Rail seal. The crates were positioned precisely where a blast would send rock shrapnel down into the camp like grape shot from a cannon. They examined the ground carefully. Multiple sets of boot prints coming and going over several days. In the soft earth near one crate, Taji recognized Bill's distinctive heel pattern, a small triangular chip missing from the left heel, probably from kicking it against something hard. He had seen that same pattern in the street, outside the saloon, in the ash at the burned camp. But there was something else. A set of moccasin prints Apache made moving among the boot prints, fresh prints made within the last day. Quanah knelt beside them, her face tightening with recognition and dread. "Those are Null Nishes," she said quietly. Null Nish, the 7-year-old boy who sat in Helen's classroom, who could read English and write his name in careful letters. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Someone in the camp had been feeding information to Dulac's men, tracking the movements of the Apache families, reporting who resisted and who might be pressured to leave. Later confronting the boy's uncle, an older man named Delche, who had been wounded and captured years before. They learned the truth. Dulac had promised Delche, if he provided information, his family would be given good land near the fort and protection. Delchet, desperate and broken by years of watching children go hungry, had agreed. He had not known they planned to massacre immigrants and blame his people. The knowledge broke him completely. He wept like a child begging forgiveness that could not be given. "They used my words to plan murder," he said through tears. "They took what I told them and twisted it into this." The terrible irony of it settled on them all. The conspiracy was even deeper than they had imagined, layers of manipulation designed to destroy the Apache community from both outside and within. They had less than 2 days before Dulac's public meeting. If they could not stop the attack on the immigrant camp and bring proof of the conspiracy, the river and all the people who depended on it were finished. Taji stood among the crates of blasting powder, his wounded arm throbbing his mind, working through the implications. The morning sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, making the air shimmer. His good hand rested on the rough wooden surface of a crate, splinters catching at his callous palm. Quanah crouched beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion and the terrible knowledge of betrayal from within their own community. "They will kill everyone in that camp," she said, her voice low and fierce. "And when they scatter Apache arrows in the wreckage, no one will question the story. We will be hunted like animals." Malcolm, breathing hard from the climb up the rocky slope, leaned against a boulder. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the relatively cool morning air. "If we move the powder, they will know we were here and accelerate their plans. If we do nothing, those people die, and we lose any chance of exposing the truth." Henrik limping badly on his bad leg. He had turned his ankle on the trail, pointed down at the camp below, where smoke rose from breakfast fires. "We warn them. We tell them to move. His only chance." It was a desperate gamble. The immigrants might panic, might refuse to believe them, might even turn Taji over to the authorities for the bounty on his head. But there was no other choice that did not involve watching innocents die. They descended carefully, hands raised in a gesture of peace, approaching the camper with slow, deliberate movements. A stocky man with a thick black beard and suspicious eyes stepped forward, an old muzzle-loading rifle leveled at chest height. His name was John Voboda, and he spoke broken English heavily accented, with Czech mixed with German phrases when he could not find the English words. Malcolm did his best to explain the plot using halting German he had learned during the war, and gestures to supplement words. "Powder explosion, blame you kill Apache." He pointed to the ridge to where the crates were hidden. Jean's people gathered around, voices rising in alarm and confusion. Some wanted to flee immediately to harness the teams and run. Others wanted to fight to defend what little they owned. A few thought it was a trick, a scheme to rob them while their guard was down. An old woman with a face like weathered wood silenced them with a sharp command in Czech. She examined Taji's face for a long moment, then Malcolm's, then Henrik's. Finally, she nodded once. "We trust," she said in halting English. "We move." They worked through the morning with desperate efficiency, helping the immigrants pack essentials, food, water, blankets, tools, and prepared to move their wagons. The plan was to relocate to a side gulch half a mile away, well out of range of any explosion, and leave the camp looking occupied. Smoke from banked fires close hung on lines livestock, tethered as usual. If Dulac's men came to set the blast, they would think the camp was still occupied until it was too late. As the sun climbed toward noon, casting harsh shadows, Taji and Quanah scouted the ridges above the camp, watching for early arrivals. They moved carefully, using every scrap of cover, aware that they were being hunted. It was on the return journey, as they tried to angle back toward Dry River, to intercept Bill's gang, or at least get closer to town before the confrontation that the trap closed. The bounty hunters rose from a dry wash like devils from hell, rifles braced on the crumbling red earth. The first shot winded past Taji's ear, close enough that he felt the hot breath of its passage. Henrik's horse went down with a scream that was almost human. Shot through the chest, throwing Henrik hard enough that he bounced when he hit. Quanah dove behind a boulder with the girls, her body covering theirs. Taji, half dragged by his panicked horse, slammed into gravel and lost his breath, and the impact driving the air from his lungs in a whoosh. There were 6 of them, hard-faced men who made their living collecting bounties and asking no questions about guilt or innocence. They wore range clothes, dusty from travel, carried repeating rifles, and moved with the easy confidence of men who had done this many times before. Pinned behind scattered rocks that provided inadequate cover, Taji and his group traded shots with growing desperation. The hunters closed in methodically, using fire and movement tactics that spoke of military training. They knew Taji was wounded. They could see the blood-stained sling. They knew he could not run or fight at full strength. Henrik, stunned from his fall, tried to scramble toward better cover. One bullet clipped his right thigh, spinning him around and dropping him into the dust like a puppet with cut strings. He lay there, gasping, blood spreading across his trouser leg in an expanding stain. Quanah's hands shook as she reloaded the borrowed Winchester, fumbling the cartridges. One slipped through her fingers and bounced away. She had perhaps 6 rounds left, maybe fewer. Taji crawled to her across the open ground, ignoring the bullets that kicked up dirt around him. One round struck so close that gravel stung his face like thrown sand. He reached her position and placed his good hand over hers, where they gripped the rifle, steadying the weapon. "Breathe with me," he murmured, his lips close to her ear so she could hear him over the gunfire. In out slow, their shoulders pressed together, his chest along her back. The shape of them molded by the rock that barely shielded them. She felt his breath against her neck, steady despite the chaos. Felt the heat of his body and the strength that remained despite his wound. He felt the tension in her spine, the way her muscles coiled for the shot, the fierce determination that kept her fighting when others would have surrendered. "On 3, he whispered. 1, 2, 3. They rose together as one, moving with perfect coordination, born of mutual trust. Their shots rang out almost simultaneously. 2 hunters fell, one clutching his shoulder, one dropping his rifle and stumbling backward. The remaining 4 scattered, suddenly less confident, seeking cover of their own. In the brief lull, Malcolm dragged Henrik behind a larger boulder. The wound was bad, and the bullet had torn through muscle, but missed the bone. Henrik would live if they could stop the bleeding and prevent infection, but he could not run or ride far. The standoff lasted another 20 minutes. Shots traded back and forth across 50 yards of rocky ground. Ammunition ran low on both sides. Finally, the hunters withdrew toward Whirlwind Pass, dragging their wounded with them and shouting threats about returning with reinforcements. Afterward, in the ringing silence, Quanah looked down at where Taji's hand still rested over hers on the rifle stock. Their fingers were intertwined, brown skin against brown skin, calluses pressed together for a heartbeat. Neither moved, the moment stretching like pulled taffy. Then she pulled away all business again and ran to help Malcolm bind Henrik's leg with strips torn from her own petticoat. Back in Dry River, events moved with terrible momentum. Lightning Bill's gang charged the decoy wagon camp at Coal Creek just after sunset, whooping and firing their revolvers into the air to panic livestock. They set the blasting powder with a long fuse, 30 seconds enough time to get clear, and spurred their horses away. The explosion rocked the hills, a bone-deep boom that Taji and his group felt even miles away. The ground shuddered beneath their feet. A column of smoke and dust coiled into the sky, black against the darkening blue, visible for miles in every direction. To anyone watching from town, it looked exactly like an Apache attack: sudden violence, destruction, chaos. The stage was set for Duloc's final move. Word reached them via a terrified boy, young Nal Nish, the same child who had sat in Helen's classroom, sent by Helen herself on a borrowed mule. His message was breathless and panicked. Duloc's men had seized Dr. Malcolm while he was trying to send a telegraph to the federal marshal in Tucson. They were holding him under guard at the half-finished railroad trestle outside town. If he spoke at the public meeting, it would be under their guns, his words twisted to support their narrative. The trap was closing from all sides. They had less than 24 hours before the meeting that would seal the fate of the Apache families. Night fell with thunderheads rolling over the blue hills like an invading army, dark and heavy, with the promise of one of the rare late summer storms that occasionally swept across the territory. Lightning flickered inside the clouds, illuminating them from within. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as Taji Kwana, Helen Henrik, limping badly but refusing to be left behind, and the two girls approached the railroad trestle at the edge of Dry River. The trestle was a skeletal structure of raw timber, half-finished, stretching 50 ft above a rocky ravine where a seasonal creek ran when it rained. It was Duloc's monument to progress, the physical manifestation of his vision for the town's future. They split into two groups as lightning split the sky. Henrik, despite his wounded leg, led the girls and Helen to safety behind a low bluff 50 yards from the trestle, where the ground was solid and the line of sight clear enough to provide warning if anyone approached. "If this goes wrong," Henrik said to Helen, his voice rough, "you take the girls and you ride. You ride hard, and you don't stop until you reach the fort. You make them listen." Helen's face was pale in the flickering lightning, but her voice was steady. "It will not go wrong." Taji and Kwana crept along the ravine that led to the trestle, using every boulder, every scrub bush, every shadow for concealment. The rain grew heavier, turning the ground slick and treacherous. It worked in their favor, masking sound and blurring vision. Up ahead, torchlight flickered over the timbers of the half-built bridge. A dozen of Duloc's men were assembled, hired guns and drifters who would do anything for money. Dr. Malcolm was tied to an upright post near the center of the structure, his face bruised and swollen, his hands bound behind him with hemp rope. Lightning Bill stood beside him, a bottle in one hand, laughing at something one of the other men said. Near the edge of the trestle sat 8 more crates of blasting powder, positioned to bring the whole structure down if necessary. Duloc's insurance policy, a way to destroy evidence if things went wrong. Kwana and Taji moved like ghosts, staying low, using the ravine as cover. They reached the base of the trestle and began to climb the support timbers' hand-over-hand feet, finding purchase on cross braces. Taji's wounded arm screamed in protest, but he forced himself to ignore it. Above them, the guards were focused on Malcolm, on the approaching storm, on their own conversation. One guard finally noticed movement, a shadow that should not be there. He opened his mouth to shout. Taji shot him with Malcolm's borrowed pistol, the report sharp, even against the thunder. The guard fell from the trestle, tumbling 30 ft into the ravine with a scream that cut off abruptly. Suddenly, the structure erupted in chaos. Men shouted, reaching for weapons. Kwana fired the Winchester, working the lever with practiced speed, laying down covering fire while Taji scrambled up the last 10 ft to the deck. He reached Malcolm, cut his bonds with a knife, and shoved him toward the edge. "Jump!" he shouted over the thunder and gunfire. "The water!" Malcolm hesitated for only a second and then threw himself off the trestle into the darkness below. There was a splash as he hit the seasonal creek, now running swift with rainfall. Bill fired at Taji, the bullet passing so close it tugged at his shirt. Taji returned fire, forcing Bill to dive for cover. Quanah reached the powder crates and began rolling them toward the edge, letting them tumble into the ravine where they could not be easily reached. One of Duloc's men panicked and stupid fired at a crate that was still on the trestle. The bullets struck the wood, sending splinters flying. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the powder ignited. The blast was smaller than a coal creek, but devastating at close range. The shock wave slammed Taji sideways into a timber post hard enough to crack ribs. Splinters flew like arrows. A section of trestle collapsed, sending 3 men screaming into the ravine. Fire bloomed orange and furious, hissing in the rain. The explosion brought people running from town, men with rifles, women clutching shawls, children drawn by the spectacle. Within minutes, the street was full of townspeople demanding answers, their fear and confusion creating a volatile situation. Duloc, ever the opportunist, seized the moment. He stood in the center of the main street, streaming from his expensive hat, and began to speak with the practiced ease of a politician. His voice carried over the storm, painting a picture of Apache treachery, of innocent railroad workers defending themselves against savage attack, of the need for decisive action to secure the future. Lightning Bill, singed but alive, held aloft a blood-smeared arrow, one of the fake ones planted at Coal Creek as physical proof of Apache guilt. That was when Taji and Quanah rode in from the far end of the street, water streaming from their clothes, their horses altered and blowing. Henrik hobbled behind them, supported by Helen. Malcolm, soaked and bruised, but alive, clutched his precious ledger to his chest with both arms. Behind them came Gene Svoboda and 5 of his immigrant families, their faces grim. Them their presence testimony to the truth. Taji threw the soaked saddlebags from the survey map wrapped in oilcloth and a handful of spent cartridges stamped with Duloc's company mark into the streaming street between himself and the assembled crowd. "Tell them whose mark that is." He called, his voice cutting through the rain like a blade. "Tell them who planned to murder these people and blame my family." Henrik, his Norwegian accent thick with pain and anger, told the crowd about his burned field, about the men who had done it, about the lies. They left Apache arrows that no Apache ever made. He said, "They told you I was dead when I stand here breathing." Malcolm, water dripping from his beard, shouted the details of his investigation calibers that matched wounds that formed patterns, dates that proved systematic persecution. Helen held up pages from the ledger, protected in oilcloth at the ink running, but still legible enough to read the names and dates. The Czech and German immigrants spoke in broken English, pointing at Bill as the man they had seen near the blast site at Coal Creek, describing the distinctive chip in his left boot heel. The crowd wavered like a banner in shifting wind. Doubt seeped in through the cracks in Duloc's story. People looked from the evidence in the street to the man who had been asking them to trust him to invest their futures in his railroad. Sheriff Consincade, seeing his patron's grip slipping, yelled for the posse to hang Taji and Quanah. "Anyway, this town doesn't need lectures from savages and foreigners and school marms." He snarled, his hand on his gun. "We know what's right for ourselves." Some men stepped forward with ropes already tied into noose. Others hung back, looking from the evidence, to their children clinging to their skirts, to the immigrants whose wagons had nearly been destroyed, to the doctor they had known for years. A lightning bolt slammed into a water barrel near the saloon with a crack like artillery fire, exploding the barrel and sending burning staves flying. The sudden flames set scattered planks and awnings alight despite the rain. Horses reared in panic. People screamed and scattered. In the confusion, Bill fired at Taji, the bullet meant for his chest, but striking a glancing blow across his ribs instead. The world narrowed to tunnel vision. Taji saw only Bill, the man who had served under the colonel, who killed his father, who had poured whiskey on children, who had burned homes and killed innocents in the night. They crashed together in the streaming street boots, slipping on the slick surface trading punches with the desperate fury of men who knew only one of them would walk away. Bill was heavier by 30 using his bulk to drive Taji down into the earth. Taji's wounded arm was useless, hanging limp, his ribs screaming where the bullet had creased them. Bill got his hands around Taji's throat and squeezed thumbs pressing into the windpipe. "Should have stayed tame, Scout," he hissed through gritted teeth. "Should have kept your head down." Taji's vision began to darken at the edges, blood roaring in his ears. He groped desperately with his good hand, fingers finding something in the street, a broken bottle, jagged and sharp. He drove it upward with all his remaining strength, the glass punching into Bill's side just below the ribs. Bill roared and released his grip, staggering backward. Taji rolled, gasping, trying to fill his lungs. Quanah tried to get a clear shot with her rifle, but Duloc appeared behind her like a ghost, grabbing her braid and yanking her head back with vicious force. She slammed her elbow into his ribs once, twice. Feeling something crack, he released her with a curse. She spun, wresting the pistol from his hand, and drove the barrel into his stomach hard enough to double him over. For a second, their eyes locked through the rain. He saw not a victim, but a woman who had survived every scheme he had thrown against her, who had endured humiliation and loss and betrayal, and still fought. "You lose," she said quietly, and struck him across the temple with the pistol butt. He dropped like a felled tree. In the street, Bill groped for his fallen revolver, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. Near him sat a broken crate from the earlier explosion, blasting oil leaking from cracked bottles into the rain-swept street. Taji, on his knees and swaying, saw the oil, saw the burning debris from the exploded barrel spreading closer. He kicked one of the bottles, sending oil splashing across Bill's chest and the ground around him in an arc. The fire reached the oil with a soft whomp, setting it alight in a brief, fierce blaze that painted the scene in hellish orange and red. Bill staggered back from the heat, his hands raised to shield his face, his shirt catching fire. Taji, moving on pure instinct and hate and justice, raised Malcolm's dropped pistol with his good hand. The weapon was a Remington .44, heavy and solid. He aimed not at center mass, but at the heart the way his father had taught him to hunt deer when he was a child. He fired once. The shot was not fancy or dramatic. It was deliberate, close, and final. The bullet took Lightning Bill Crow in the chest, punching through ribs and sternum, and the heart that had never learned mercy exiting through his back in a spray of red. Bill crumpled into the rain-soaked street at the fire hissing out around him, his body going still in the way that only death brings. The gunfire faltered and died. Men froze staring. The street fell silent except for the hiss of rain on hot metal and burning wood. Consincade swung his massive dragoon revolver toward Taji Murder, naked in his eyes and nothing left to lose. His finger tightened on the trigger. A voice barked from the edge of town, cutting through the rain like a whip crack. "Drop it, Sheriff, or I drop you." A territorial marshal and 3 deputies rode in through the downpour slickers, flapping badges glinting in the firelight. The marshal was a tall man with a gray mustache and eyes like chips of flint. His name was Garrett, and he had a reputation for honesty that was rare on the frontier. Helen's earlier telegraph, written in careful language that hinted at murder fraud and conspiracy while avoiding direct accusations that might be ignored, had finally borne fruit. Garrett had ridden hard from Tucson, changing horses twice, pushing through the storm to reach Dry River before the situation exploded completely. Dulac, regaining consciousness, lunged for a horse tied near the saloon. But townsmen now convinced they had been used as pawns in a scheme that had nothing to do with their safety and everything to do with one man's profit. Dart seized him. Ropes that had been meant for Apache necks now bound the hands of the railroad man and his sheriff instead. The storm blew itself out by dawn, leaving the sky washed clean and pale as milk. Smoke from the collapsed trestle drifted over the river, mingling with morning mist. The street was a trampled chaos of prints and spent cartridges and the dark stain where Lightning Bill had died. Bodies were buried in a rocky patch beyond town that served as a cemetery. 2 townsmen caught in crossfire. One of Garrett's deputies, who had taken a bullet in the initial exchange, 4 of Dulac's riders. There was no triumph in the shoveling, only the weary necessity of putting the dead in the ground before the sun brought the smell. Marshal Garrett took Dulac Kincaid and 6 surviving gang members into custody, shackling them in a freight wagon for the long journey to Tucson and the territorial court. Whether they would hang or buy their way free through expensive lawyers was a question for judges and juries. Justice moved slowly on the frontier, grinding like a millstone, but at least it was moving. "Will they hang?" Quanah asked Garrett as the wagon prepared to leave. The marshal considered her question seriously. "Dulac has money and connections. He might get prison instead of rope. Kincaid is small potatoes. He'll likely hang for the murders we can prove. The others will scatter to the 4 winds if they get a chance." He paused, then added, "That's not the justice you want to hear, but it's the truth." "Truth is better than lies," she said quietly. In Dry River, life did not magically heal. The wounds ran too deep, the scars too fresh. But small changes began like grass pushing through burned ground. Henrik's leg healed badly, the bullet having nicked a tendon, leaving him with a permanent limp. But he kept his modest claim, and with Apache help labor exchanged for shared water rights. He rerouted a small irrigation ditch that saved half his crops and provided water for 3 Apache families downstream. He hired Hialeah and Yoki to help with the calves and chickens, paying them in coin and fresh milk and teaching them Swedish words that made them laugh. Doctor after Malcolm reopened his clinic, the bullet holes in the walls patched, but visible a reminder of the night Dulac's men had tried to silence him. He treated townsfolk and Apaches alike, his ledger now locked in a safe, no longer just a list of injuries, but a legal record that had helped bring down a criminal conspiracy. Helen formally resigned from the town school after the council threatened to dismiss her for radical activities endangering white children. She opened a 1-room schoolhouse on the edge of Apache land, teaching letters and numbers and history to whoever showed up with clean hands and a willingness to learn. Apache children sat beside the sons and daughters of poor white farmers and Mexican laborers learning together. It was not something the town had a name for yet. Back then, not in any law book, but it was a beginning. Taji and Quanah spent weeks helping rebuild the burnt wickiups farther upriver, where the soil was slightly better and the water more reliable. They worked shoulder to shoulder in the aftermath, lifting rafters, digging post holes, stretching hides over frames. When heavy timbers needed lifting, it was Henrik and 2 other ranchers who brought their oxen, spreading the strain across multiple families. One evening, while marking out new garden plots, using string and stakes to keep the rows straight, Taji and Quanah worked in comfortable silence. Their fingers met around an iron chain link as they stretched it between 2 stakes. Neither pulled back for a long moment, the metal warm from their hands and the connection deliberate. "Your arm has healed well," she said finally, not looking at him. "Your hands are strong," he replied. "You could pull that stake from the ground if you wanted. I do not want to." The moment passed. They returned to work. But something had shifted, settled like stones, finding their place in a wall. A few townsfolk still spat when Apaches walked past, but fewer each week. The spot in the street where whiskey had once soaked the girl's hair had been churned and rained on and walked over until no trace remained absorbed into the earth like so much else. 6 weeks later, on a cool October morning, when the cottonwoods had turned gold and the air smelled of coming winter, a packet of official papers arrived in Dry River with the territorial marshal seal. Malcolm gathered Taji Quana, Helen Henrik, and several Apache elders by the riverbank, where the water ran clear over smooth stones. He opened the packet with care, unfolding documents sealed with red wax and stamped with official emblems. "The territorial court has issued its ruling," he said, adjusting his spectacles to read the formal language. The trial had been swift by frontier standards. Duloc's expensive lawyers from San Francisco had argued that their client was merely a businessman caught up in unfortunate circumstances. But the testimony of the Czech immigrants, whose near death had been witnessed by too many people to deny, combined with Malcolm's meticulous records and the physical evidence of the survey maps and company-marked ammunition, had proved impossible to refute entirely. Pierre Dulac had been sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. Sheriff King and 2 of his deputies had been hanged for murder. 3 of the surviving raiders had been sentenced to prison terms. The rest had been released for lack of evidence and had promptly disappeared into the territory. But there was more. The court, under pressure from the scandal and seeking to demonstrate that justice could be impartial, had ruled portions of Duloc's river property forfeit as proceeds of a criminal conspiracy. A specific parcel, 320 acres that included the rebuilt Apache camp and a narrow, fertile stretch of riverbank, was to be granted as trust land under the name of Cana, recognized as surviving head of her brother Cochetta's family. The surprise was not mystical or miraculous. It was ink on paper signatures and stamps and the slow grinding of legal machinery that for once, just once, had produced something approaching justice. Guana took the papers slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as they smoothed the creases. Legal possession did not erase the graves behind her, did not bring her brother back, did not undo the humiliation and terror and loss. But it gave the children something beyond fear. It gave them ground to stand on, seeds, to plant a future that was not just flight and hiding. "That land is still dirt and water," she said softly to Taji, her voice nearly lost under the murmur of the river. "We will have to fight drought every summer. We will have to fight men who resent that we have anything at all. We will have to fight rust and frost and bad luck." He nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "Then you should not do it alone." He had received an offer from Marshal Garrett to work as a deputy tracking outlaws and murderers through the territory, hunting men like Lightning Bill instead of his own people for broken promises and worthless treaties. The pay was decent, the work dangerous, but meaningful. For a long moment, he looked down the river where the telegraph poles marched away toward distant cities full of people who would never know his name or care about this small corner of the frontier. Then he looked back at the camp where children chased each other between corn mounds, their laughter bright and careless in the way children's laughter should be. "I will ride for the marshal when he needs me," he said carefully. "But my home is here." Their last shared image was not a kiss under sunset or a dance in some saloon or any of the romantic gestures that dime novels celebrated. It was work. That afternoon, the river threatened to overflow its banks after 3 days of upstream rain had swelled the current. Together with a dozen others, Apache and white and Mexican, all with stakes in the water, they dragged heavy stones to shore up the bank where erosion had eaten at the edges. It was brutal labor that left backs bent and hands raw and legs trembling with exhaustion. At one point, Quanah lost her footing on the slick clay and began to slide toward the deeper channel where the current ran strong enough to sweep a person away. Taji's hand shot out, closing around her wrist with desperate strength. His boots braced against a half-buried root. He pulled her back to solid ground, not letting go even after she had her balance. Breathless clothes stray with clay and river mud. They stood waist-deep in the cold water, holding the same shovel handle, pushing it down into the bank to anchor the stones. The river slapped against their legs, angry and relentless, trying to tear their work apart. But the wall held because they held it together. On the main street of Dry River, people paused in their errands to watch Apache women walking upright past the saloons, their heads high, their steps steady baskets of vegetables on their hips to sell or trade. No one poured whiskey on them now. No one dared. The spot where Lightning Bill had died was just another patch of packed earth marked only by the way certain men averted their eyes when they walked over it, carrying their private guilt. The scaffold outside the jail, where ropes had once waited for Apache necks, was dismantled on a cold November morning. The lumber was donated to Helen's schoolhouse to build proper desks. Henrik limped into the general store with Haya at his side one Saturday, the girl carrying a basket of eggs to trade. The shopkeeper's wife, who had once refused to serve Apaches, counted out the eggs carefully and offered a fair price without comment. It was not friendship, but it was business, conducted with basic respect. And that was a beginning. Helen taught a class where a white girl and an Apache boy recited their multiplication tables together, stumbling over the harder numbers, laughing at each other's mistakes without malice. She also taught them about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, about how laws were supposed to protect everyone equally, even when they failed to do so, about how change came slowly, but could come if people insisted on it. Delsha, the man who had betrayed his own people under Duloc's manipulation, lived among them still, but apart working the hardest tasks, seeking no forgiveness, because he knew he did not deserve it. His nephew Nal Nish stayed in Helen's school and learned to write beautiful letters in English, and Apache both determined to tell the true story someday. The river still ran through contested land. There would be more droughts that tested their resolve, more men with schemes who saw opportunity in other people's desperation, more fights over water and boundaries and the right to simply exist. The legal victory was fragile, dependent on territorial courts that might be overturned by statehood, on treaties that might be broken on the whims of politicians 1,000 miles away. But the pattern had shifted measurably. The balance once tilted entirely toward those who held the guns, and the deeds and the political connections had moved just enough to matter, just enough to offer hope. Taji and Kana stood by the river as the sun dropped toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold and deep purple. Their hands, rough from work and scarred from struggle, touched briefly as they passed a dipper of water between them, sharing the drink in the Apache way that signified partnership. Neither spoke. There was no need for words. The land stretched out around them, hard, dry, unforgiving, beautiful in its harshness. But it was theirs now in a way that had the weight of law behind it. Fragile though that protection might be, they would hold it together. They would hold it against whatever came for as long as they could for the children who deserved to grow up. Without whiskey poured on their heads, without fear that tomorrow someone would come with guns and papers to take everything away. The gunslinger had taunted an Apache woman and thought it a joke, a moment's entertainment on a dull afternoon. The reckoning that followed was not just one bullet in a storm, but a slow, stubborn rebuilding of land and law of community, and trust of the fragile, fierce bond between a warrior who had learned when to fight and a woman who refused to bow. In the distance, a child's laughter carried on the evening breeze. It was the sound of a future being born from the ashes of a violent past, imperfect,